Hi, everybody. Welcome to Designing Enterprise Sites. My name is Graham Hudgens. I'm a product engineer on ArcGIS Hub and ArcGIS Enterprise Sites. And today we have a good agenda for you. I'm going to give you a really short introduction of the app, mentioning both Enterprise Sites and Hub if you're in ArcGIS Online. We'll talk a good bit about planning. In the middle, we'll have some designers join us and give us some of their tips. And then we'll walk through building a site and highlight some of those design practices as you're building a site. This talk is definitely going to be more design leaning and less of a deep customization or an introduction talk or a talk about something else. So if you're kind of here, hopefully you're here for some design best practices and things like that. So ArcGIS Enterprise Sites is a capability that lets you create websites and web pages. And the goal of these websites is to reach your non-GIS user. And so that's your kind of everyday person, maybe within your enterprise, your organization, or maybe it's other people with access to your systems, but that's somebody who's not a GIS expert, knows anything about it. So this is a part of ArcGIS Enterprise, and it's a included capability as of 10.6.1, with the main focus at launching websites and web pages targeting non-GIS users. These websites and web pages are going to feature content from your enterprise portal. So, any number of apps or data sets or other content that you've uploaded into your portal can be made available on these sites and pages. But the key here is that we're using it to try to reach that non-GIS user. It's worth highlighting that in ArcGIS Online, this capability is included in an app called ArcGIS Hub. We're actually going to be looking at a lot of examples from online because the very nature of enterprise is we can't, see behind your networks in most cases. There are a few running publicly, but, Hub is going to be a much better resource to find good examples. So we'll take a look at those. And then there's an additional offering in Hub as well. So before we get going, it's always a good idea to know where the app is and what we're talking about. I always tell people, build something with no plan to get a feel for things. So if you're getting ready to make your very first site, make sure you have a creator user in the portal. You need these 5 privileges. It's about a publisher, level of user access. And if you have these other privileges marked below, you'll be able to pull in help around your enterprise site, but not totally required. The app is here in the app launcher if you've never found it before. It's a tile made available there. And soon in Enterprise, it will be in the Create menu, but it's not there yet. When you land in the app, you'll be taken to this Enterprise Sites overview page. This is where you can return to previous sites that you were editing, and you can also make new ones. So just a quick kind of springboard into all the different sites. I have seen people, once they launch their sites, embed it in their app launcher or make other accommodations to make that site easier to find. We'll talk more about that in a little bit, but just another idea there. So now that you've made your first one, before we get into the design process and designing an effective site and going through kind of the nitty-gritties of really good best practices for making that site great, I think it's a good idea to just shop around and literally go look at a lot of sites and see kind of what you find to be more useful and what you find to be less useful. So I'll give you a few resources for this, but like I mentioned before, ArcGIS Online is a great place to kind of peruse, to see kind of how people have designed their sites and why they've made specific choices about the layout. So this is a good example. This is like a high contrast banner here telling me the point of this is state information, government data, and then you can kind of see the layout immediately wants me to go search. So sites have this ability to search their content. New in the later versions of ArcGIS Enterprise, we have autocomplete and these collections coming in 10.8.1. And we also have these categories, and these categories can be links out to things like pages. You can also have it search your content. So within each site, we can have some number of search results. This is a really good user experience if we want to feature a lot of items on our site. So, you don't have to design a site that uses search, but if you have 1,787 items, then maybe you want to. And then once you click on an item, this is pulling from all the item information, like the description, the terms of use license, for example. I can actually read, different things there. And tags and other metadata is available here too. So, basically this is only going to be as good as your items are. And there are some other talks that kind of feature data best practices, but very much is an important part of your design is having good data. You'll notice at the top we have this header. The header is another pretty important design choice as to how to get people around your site and what are the different sections. This site chose to use pages to organize different logical chunks of information. So you can kind of see like a thanks to organizations. Here's their featured apps that you can jump into, which is nice. In the later versions, we've added this app page functionality, which lets us embed applications underneath the header. So you can kind of have this consistent user experience where you're bouncing between the apps and the site. Here you can see there have some training resources, so you can kind of get the general idea. When we take a look at headers in a little bit, the nice thing about the out-of-the-box header is it does really well on a mobile phone. So here you can see it kind of collapses down, and you can have this menu, which is really easy to use. So that's kind of a good reason why the header's an option there. So that kind of gives you the lay of the land of a site, and you can kind of tell that these people really just wanted us to find thousands of pieces of items and thank a few people and organize it in more of the type of items that people are looking for. This is really good if you're just trying to give somebody access to, let's say, your whole portal's worth of content or a large number of it, and you're not really sure why they're coming to your site. So you're kind of focusing on the primary action being searching or finding those chunks of data that you've pre-prepared for them. A couple of other sites to look at is very similar, data-driven site that kind of features all of their content here in DC at opendata.dc.gov. They have a little bit more going on in their layout, top to bottom. Kind of goes on for a while. It gets a little, lengthy in terms of content, but it gets more granular as you go. So at the top, it's very high level. There's some really main projects that they want you to look at. You can click into those projects and now you get a whole website about that project. And then as you scroll down, everything gets a little bit more granular. You get access to the data. So this is kind of illustrating that above the fold focus and that below the fold focus. And similarly, they're using the same kind of header to get around. So you kind of see a couple patterns emerge there. Skipping ahead, this is my county here in Pennsylvania. They have kind of a similar vibe as the other two, very kind of citywide, countywide information available for you, divided up into some number of subdivisions, and I can come in and find, maybe I'm interested in land development or something specific, or I'm interested in the data. So kind of very data focused. So I'm going to skip those two. So another one to look at is the more project style site. If you're trying to expose specific information about a specific topic, maybe a budget, for example, this is a good example of that. Or you can see maybe the performance, looking at how well is a city doing in a bunch of metrics. So these are these sites that are not focused as much about finding, but more about exposing key apps and maps and content. Here I can see a story map and a couple of other charts and graphs and things coming from their system. So you can kind of get a feeling for this site has a little bit of a different purpose than the previous sites we were just looking at. And similarly, some sites have just objectives outright, and they just want you to see a piece of information or do something or follow or do something very in your face. So they can be very simple as well. So kind of think about your audience when you're doing this and try to imagine, which type of site is resonating the most with you so far, because it'll help you later on. These folks, for example, the kind of primary action here is to, click one of these areas and get started volunteering or attending an event. So it's kind of less data focused, but still exposing some data, just kind of like the previous one. And then last but not least, if you're interested in finding examples yourself, go to hub.arcgis.com. There's two resources here that are really useful. First is the gallery. These are some of our favorites that we just pick out. If you're ever interested in being on the gallery, definitely drop us a line on GeoNet or contact us. We're always looking for new sites. So that's a kind of a very distilled list of sites that are out there. If I go back here, what I can do is I can just search all of Hub for all of its public sites and actually just browse. So if I'm looking for a specific topic, I could come in here and basically search for it. Hub.arcgis.com is a good way of searching all of ArcGIS online, and there isn't really an equivalent with Enterprise, unfortunately. So, you know, kind of the nature of the beast with Enterprise being, you know, in your own networks is that it's yours. And so best way to kind of get inspired is to come here and try to find things and pick up on design trends, show it to some stakeholders, and then move on from there. Okay, so hopefully with all that inspiration loaded up in our minds, the next step is to do some planning. And there's this saying in scuba diving that you should plan the dive and then dive the plan. Since you're already familiar a little bit with the app and you kind of have this idea in mind, this is a good time to have some good discussions with your stakeholders. Because upfront conversations are really important. You know, the web is likely someone's domain in your organization. There's some existing place that you probably want to be a part of. You know, this basically bringing people to the table early will help integration later. And you also might get free resources and design advice from other parts of your organization by asking the right questions. So if you're at this point where you're like, I think I know what I want to build, this is the kind of the next step I would recommend. If you don't do any sort of planning, and it maybe you don't need to, but this is kind of what you're going to end up with. You're going to have a bunch of islands of different, you know, sites with different purposes kind of growing on their own in the wild organically. And the problem with a bunch of islands is, you know, you need a boat or a map or a, you know, it's kind of hard to get between them, and there isn't a lot of cohesiveness, and you're not teaching any patterns to your users. You're just kind of giving them a bunch of different user experiences jumbled up on the web. So maybe you want to build something more like this, which is like a well-organized city with a center, with different districts or regions, and with a kind of cohesive way of getting around. Just like if we have any urban planners watching, I'm sure they can tell you more about that. So if you are interested in this, you know, then you need to ask yourself a couple of questions to figure out what is basically going to be your sitemap. First is, how will this fit into your existing site somewhere, or will it? And so if you're thinking about this in like a public sense, this is like, will it fit into your organization's website.com? But if you're thinking about it internally, it's, will it fit into that existing web property people go to for this information? Now that might be your portal, in which case it will really well fit into that. But it also might be other external systems. Like I've seen people have SharePoint or Confluence or, you know, some internal place that people go to find information. So you might want to consider integrating with that to make your enterprise site very usable. And I always tell people this, but, you know, in your success, you may confront this problem. So if you do something independent and it's on its own island and it grows and it gets a lot of really popular, somebody's going to say it'd be really nice to have those two things in the same thing. You know, maybe you want to consider it up front. And matching header systems is a good idea, even if it is just branding. It'll help everybody feel like they're in a cohesive place, part of your organization, et cetera. And then I also like to ask, do you think you need that super site, the one that demonstrates everything? I don't really advise this unless you really need like a kind of information hierarchy that has like everything in there. I think a lot can be done with consistent branding and links out to things, but if you do need that kind of monolithic site, it's good to know that up front because it will affect the decisions you make. So, and a lot of people like that. So if we want to just kind of play out how your sites can mature, maybe you start in the beginning and you have these three with different requirements, different groups, different departments. The first thing you can do is you could use the portal, that home screen inside of the home app of the portal to launch off to all the sites that you have. I've seen people configure the gallery to have items that point to these sites, and then they can click it. And that way you have this kind of jumping off point. So here's just a really basic example of what I mean. These could each be sites. You could click on them. You find your way from the portal into this site and you're off and running. This is also really nice because non-GIS users might have been already trained to log into the portal. Now they can find the content in an easier form factor than if they were trying to explore and find it themselves directly. So that's a kind of maturity level 1. Maturity level 2 is rather than having 3 different sites, pick kind of common look and feel, common set of theme or header to align these sites. This can be really useful, again, just to make that experience a good one. And then the other thing you could do if you need that monolithic experience where you have the site that has everything in it, you could make a site instead of using the portal as that kind of role. And then that means you have a site that has everything on it, and then it links off to those other sub-sites. Very similar to that DC site we were looking at just moments ago. I was able to go to their site, see all their active projects, click one of them, and now I'm on another site just around that project. So that kind of gives you an idea of what that's all about. So yeah, here's just that example. You can kind of see multiple sites. They're actually separate, but they are all styled similarly and linked up together. And don't forget that, you know, we always have access to pages within each site. So even if you tie a couple sites together this way, you still have another level beyond that. So this is how like a specific project can have different experiences for each one. So if you're going to make a sitemap, literally, PowerPoint has smart art if you're interested in that. It's effectively just a bulleted list. You could do something fancy like a diagram. This is a great way to plan, is make a sitemap, understand the different audiences. It's a very fun planning exercise. Very commonly, it'll look like this, where you're going to get in a whiteboard and be drawing boxes and arrows. And that's exactly a good way to get consensus and begin the design process about the different solution you're trying to develop. Just to show how crazy it can be, this is Wikipedia sitemap. You probably don't want to go that extreme with this, but just kind of showing that like there may already be a sitemap to your internal systems built by the people who configured them originally. For our next section, we want to do a designer roundtable. Rather than just hearing from me the whole time, I thought it might be good for you to hear from some of our designers on the Hub team. So with me, I have Clara Schmidt, who's a UI UX designer, and Sam Hunter, who has the same role. Hi, guys.
Hi.
Thanks for joining for this recording. So I wanted to just ask these three questions. The first is kind of tell me a little bit about the most important thing you do when planning your site, or maybe just some high-level design principles, like the things that are kind of most important to have in your mind up front. Sam, do you want to kind of give a crack at it?
Sure. I would say, first of all, knowing what your purpose is. So if you're sharing information, make sure you have that listed out. Less is more when considering text. Maybe try to write it all out. It can be very wordy at first, and then try to pare it down. Think easy, scannable, headings, and then your hierarchy should be clear. So make sure you're using consistent headers down the page, things like that. They should be larger than your body copy. So using size and consistent labeling of things. And then also making sure your calls to actions are clear. So your button should be descriptive instead of saying something like learn more. Maybe if you're going to an interactive dashboard, the button should say go to dashboard. So things like that.
Cool. Clara, do you have anything to add?
The thing that I would say regarding text and copy, it might be worth doing a content inventory. So all the little bits of content that you're intending to put on the page, then you can structure it. Use information architecture to determine what should be a primary heading, primary copy, your primary call to action, because it is worth knowing what your audience is and what your intended goal is. And if you're serving multiple audiences, it's relevant to like chunk it out into pieces that like lets each audience zoom into the bit that they kind of need to get to first.
Awesome.
Right, like Clara said, maybe you have a dedicated row for each audience or something like that when you're building your site.
That's great. Okay. So my next question is just, I think you touched on this already a little bit, but do you have any kind of layout favorites? We're going to be looking in a few minutes at the layout editor in some detail, but just kind of at a high level, like your favorite kind of pieces of the Hub layout engine. Clara, do you have any ideas about this one?
It's useful. So again, just going back to the text bit, it's like be careful not to overwhelm people with too much text because people just really don't read. They want to skim. So like a bold heading on each section that you have that lets people glance down the page and get a gist of what the information is being presented. Looks nice. Having a lot of white space. Images are great that are like eye-catching, and I'll go into a little later on what to avoid with images. And one of the things we have observed on sites that are really eye-catching, they have like a strong banner image, but they also, if they have text on the banner, they have a pretty good contrast between your banner text and your banner image. So if you are missing that contrast, you might want to use the transparency tool to dim the image into the background color to increase the contrast between your text and your background image.
That's awesome. We could take a look at that in a little bit in a demo. That's a great idea. Sam, anything to add?
Yeah, so Claire had also mentioned about the headings, and also one tip, I guess, is just to try to think, this is also going to help your SEO to keep it short, and think like, what might people Google about this content? So that could help you make it, you know, catchier and short.
That's awesome. Great idea. So yeah, I guess the last area I wanted to just ask you, and I think, you know, heard a little bit of it, is the kind of things that make your eye twitch that you see people do, kind of common pitfalls or traps, anything like that come to mind?
Yes, so I'll launch back into the image bit. So it is very tempting to get those eye-catching images to go to sites like Unsplash or Pixels that provide free images and grab the highest resolution image possible that you can come up with, because that allows you to scale your site from a mobile layout to a desktop layout and have an image that looks great for both. The downside is that it slows loading time on mobile. So if somebody is looking at your site on a mobile device, that background image is going to take a while to show up. And it's really useful to use a photo editing program. I can provide Graham with a link for a free one online, or Photoshop, to resize the image to like the appropriate row background height that you might want. And we hear very often like, well, what is the appropriate resolution? What is the appropriate size for that row? And unfortunately, I can't tell you that, because it really depends on what content you put in the row. So if you stack several charts into a row, I can't tell you one image size, because you should go into that yourself and kind of take a screenshot even to generate what the maximum width you might need is, and then go into your photo editing tool and crop your photo to those dimensions, and then save it as a web format so that it will be faster to load on mobile devices. I think another thing I've seen is within Hub specifically, I would try to avoid setting heights on iframes that involve scrolling in the container, since it's a suboptimal experience for anyone scanning through on a phone. And also it feels a little weird to have in-page scrolls. It used to be popular, but it's less popular in modern web design.
Great. Sam, anything to add to Clara?
Yeah, so to piggyback on kind of what Clara was saying, also another thing you could do if you don't want to crop is there are some free image compression tools out there. So again, we can send Graham a link to that, but that might be an alternative. If you didn't want to resize, maybe you could just try to make the image as small as possible. Like me personally, I try to do even 200 kilobytes is kind of large sometimes. Like I think the recommended is between 50 and 80, but it just depends on the kind of image you have. And like Clara said, you know, if you're getting a free image from Unsplash or something like that, you know, if you have an image with a city in the background and there's buildings everywhere, you know, that will be harder to read the text on top. So maybe something where they're lower down with a sky above, so it's easier to read the words. So those are the kinds of things you should be looking for, is less visual confusion and something more simple. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you both for hanging out for a second. I think it's really valuable, and we'll take a look more at these best practices as we move forward. So thank you so much, guys. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Next up, let's take a look at some design fundamentals, taking into account for what we just heard from Clara and Sam. These are things you should think about for every site. So just taking a look at a little bit broader kind of design principles. These are from some members of our team and some designers I know, as well as Google. You can kind of see a consistent theme here is simplicity. Overly designed websites may make consensus building easy with stakeholders, but the net result won't be as usable by the people actually trying to consume the information. So try to resist the urge to, say yes to every request and intent, and focus the intent around one simple goal or a handful of simple activities. Consistency and clear navigation is something mentioned here. Readability, the color palette we'll talk a little bit more about. So these are just some ideas to kind of have in our mind as we get into the nitty-gritty of designing the layout. Brian says, make sure it's responsive. So you may, have everybody accessing your site on a desktop and be convinced that, maybe that's the primary way people experience it. But even if they're only on desktop, you don't know their resolution. Maybe they are hard of vision or some other sort of circumstance. So designing your site to work both on a cell phone as well as on a desktop will make sure that everything in between is also a really nice experience. And you can kind of see Brian also brings up that minimalism and clear purpose. And then Mary, another designer, says engaging imagery and clear action. So you can see kind of that common thread of design principles, hopefully kind of seeing that theme come out there. So with that, let's take a look at the site's layout. This is the most visual part of designing your site. If you're interested in kind of thinking about the site's content or any of the other ways you can design the site from like the data perspective, I recommend checking out the Getting Started or Deep Customization talk, as those two talks cover those areas of the site design. So we're going to focus mostly on just the visual part, since this is a more design focused talk. I always tell people, this is more applicable to the anonymous web than it is to an internal enterprise, but it's still pretty important. Imagining you're a really busy person and you're trying to get information quickly to maybe make a business decision. You really want to make it really obvious the point of your site. And I think you only have a few seconds to convey the purpose of your site. So make it like personal, departmental, let the branding and photo at the top speak for the purpose, and try to keep it simple. If you're making a project style site, I recommend using powerful imagery that's very upfront, explain some goal, and then gets you right to what you want them to do. So in this case, we want the user to click this button after they understand kind of the current state of the project. So focus on the one thing you want somebody to do and put it highest on the page. There's a bunch of examples of different types of one things out there in the examples we looked at earlier, as well as in ArcGIS Online. You can like kind of search for different sites and see what their purposes were. So like viewing a chart, searching a site, etc. The other thing I mentioned is that, mobile phones are on the rise. In online, it's over half of our traffic. In enterprise, it may be less or maybe the same, depending on if you're dealing with folks in the field, that are maybe in a location where they're accessing from a tablet or a mobile device. So definitely try to design with mobile in mind. This will come mostly into play if you get into writing your own HTML or CSS, because you're now kind of taking the burden of coming up with responsive HTML, where otherwise the enterprise sites or hub application does that for you. So looking at the layout pragmatically with those kind of design tenets in mind, we have a bunch of different parts of the site. The header is this section at the top we'll take a look at. The theme is the color palette that's used by all of the system controls and is all the defaults on many of the different rows on the site. And then the site itself is made up of rows and cards. And so each of these chunks Here you can kind of see the visual difference is the rows, and then within them there's one or more cards. And then we have a footer, which is good for your sort of legalese, additional resources, that kind of extra stuff. So this is just an idea of a site design. One thing that can be really useful once you understand those ingredients of rows and cards is to have a design thinking exercise where you try to come up with that one intention. So maybe you want to feature searching really prominently. Maybe you want to feature some apps really prominently. Trying to think about what that is and drawing it out ahead of time. Again, similar to the site mapping where you're planning multiple sites, this is a good exercise for zooming in on a single site and coming up with a really good game plan and getting people bought in before you're actually building it. So that you can do this as almost a double-edged expectation setting with lots of stakeholders, as well as low cost. You don't have to iterate on actually building it. You can just draw pictures. So your first decision, once you have that plan and you've sketched something or you have an idea, is to set up a theme for your site. You don't have to do this first, but given that the theme has such a monumental role on how everything looks and feels, if you do it later, you're going to have to go back through everything and make sure it's all still working with your theme. So try to do this up front. This is a kind of tale as old as time. Find your organization's brand guidelines. If you don't know an internal resource for that and your organization is a public organization, you can just Google yourself and find logos and things like that. Similarly, avoid font choices. You can set custom fonts. Avoid the ones that are hard to read. Some people prefer them, but kind of think about if you had really poor vision and you're trying to look at the site, how well spaced apart are the letters and what fonts have you chosen. So try to focus on those who may not have really great eyesight, and again, maybe on smaller device screens and things like that. And it's also tempting to set the theme in the layout editor. So you're over here in the layout editor and you're setting the theme and you're like, this is great. And then thinking that your theme is good just because everything you see on this screen is good, that would be a mistake. You have to make sure you test not only the layouts that you have for your site overall, but if you make any pages, the theme applies to the page as well. So see how this button is green because I have a green theme. I'm basically applying the same theme there as well. There's two other gotcha places. One of them is the search results page. So if I click into here, notice this is all very themed. And then the other is an individual items page. So if I click into here, this is all themed. So check all of them when you're kind of reviewing your themes so that you don't end up with a hard to read site. So there's a link there. And then sometimes your brand kind of sucks. You put all the colors in and it's high. The contrast isn't like high enough, like meaning like the blacks and the grays are right next to each other. Maybe you're a strict, military-ish government organization and it's all dark blues. And it just doesn't make the site look welcoming or easy to use. One really good recommendation there is to take your primary color into one of these two websites and generate a couple of palettes. Obviously, you want to make sure you're not deviating from brand where you're going to upset somebody, but this should give you a set of complementary colors or even colors on the same ramp that can follow different palette choices and may help you design a better site. I definitely recommend leaning more towards white than dark as far as backgrounds, because if you do a dark background, you're going to have to really commit to it fully. And it's going to make your site kind of have this really heavy feel, very serious feel. Maybe that's the intent, but white backgrounds will make it feel more open, spacious. So try to kind of play with your different brand colors and play with different palette options on these sites to get something that doesn't crowd the color and uses color effectively to communicate your brand, as opposed to kind of filling the page with just tons of different shades of colors and things like that. Okay, so we've done the header part, or sorry, the theme part. Now you get to move into the header. And if you've done that site mapping exercise, you probably have a feeling of what links will go into your header and how it will or will not connect to your existing web properties. So this is really where we get to implement our sitemap. We get to, if we want to, we can do some really powerful things in HTML and CSS. And we have a bunch of other options that help you achieve a good design. These header controls are new as of 10.8.0 in Enterprise, and they'll obviously be in 10.8.1 as well. They're very popular in ArcGIS Online because it makes making a header very, very easy. So to show you just a little bit of that, this is the header section. We can basically, set a number of different things. So if I have, a brand or a logo that I want to attach here, I can call this Dev Summit 20. I can have a shorter name. I can make this one really nice and long. And then as the screen basically, resizes down, you'll see that it shortens here. Eventually, there it goes. See how it kind of squishes down there. So it does a lot of that for you. It handles the collapsing menus and things like that. You can upload a logo, set the alt text to make sure it's accessible. This is where I can add menu links. What's nice is these links, if they're bound to items in your portal, they will respect that item sharing. So if you have different pages for different departments, they will only see the menu links that they have access to. You can also use an external page here. This will just be a kind of a quote unquote dumb link that will show for everybody. This is a good way to integrate that existing web property. So yeah, just kind of configure those to build that sitemap. And then, if you want to, you can enable different social icons if that's appropriate for your organization, or not. You can turn them off. And you do have a few choices of the standard header. You can have your logo there on the left next to the name, or you can put the logo and the name on the top and have a bigger area. And then both of these have really nice mobile responsiveness. Now, and you can set them to be wide if you like that too. Kind of the same way we'll see with rows here in a minute. Now, if you're interested in, and HTML and CSS, and you want to build something very, very specific, the custom HTML and CSS options are here for you. We give you this kind of boilerplate custom header. You can tell I already have a theming problem with it. So then we give you a rich HTML and CSS editor that, again, in 10.8.0 is a lot improved. It has syntax highlighting and will validate your HTML and things like that. Things to watch out for here is that you are responsible for making this responsive. And we'll talk a little bit more about using Bootstrap 3 and Flexbox to do that, but it's on you now. So it's one of those things that don't just code it in desktop and walk away. Make sure you are testing the site, by dragging the screen down to see how it's doing in mobile. Like this one has a few issues, right? Like we probably would want to maybe fix that. So you can kind of, work with it from there. There's a great part of the Getting Started talk about this specific feature of customizing HTML by one of our developers in the same kind of Developer Summit talk series. So give that a look if you're interested in doing some custom header. He goes into an immense amount of detail. Okay, so I want to give a quick lesson now in Bootstrap and cards. The layout system itself is using what's called Bootstrap 3. There is a Bootstrap 4, and we are assessing upgrading to it, but we're trying to, do that at the right time. Bootstrap is a system to put your content in these little columns. You get 12 columns in the site editor. You can make the content take up more than one column. And then what's nice is this is what powers that mobile responsiveness. And Bootstrap, as far as resources go, is a very widely accepted CSS system that is used by roughly half of the internet. So there is a lot of resources. And now that you're armed with this knowledge of Bootstrap, you can Google a lot of things, including the word Bootstrap, and find examples that you can directly use on your site. One really important thing to know about Bootstrap is that you have these classes. Bootstrap itself comes with some classes that let you show or hide different content depending on your screen size, and you can also use the Bootstrap Grid system with your custom HTML by applying these classes. If you're interested in learning more, click this link or visit this link to read the documentation about it. Fortunately, you don't need to know too much because our editor is basically a UI on top of Bootstrap. So you can see that in Enterprise Sites, you can just reflow content, dynamically between the different Bootstrap columns, and it just works. So the nice thing is, as long as you're sticking to the out-of-the-box cards, you're leveraging that Bootstrap system without too much knowledge of how it works behind the scenes. So just to show you a little bit of that, you know, and when you make your layout choices, you'll be putting content into these rows. And then this is the, inside of it, you can tell I have one card that's now, through responsiveness, it's filled up to fill all 12 columns. Let's say I add another category here, like I want to have a second category. You know, now I have two, and it by default splits 6 and 6, but maybe I want something to take up more room. With categories, it doesn't really have much of an effect, but with something like image next to text, maybe you want the image to be on desktop less prominent than the text or more prominent than the text. And so you can just mouse over the grid and move it however you want. And then again, as you go mobile, these will all stack. So you don't have to really do anything to make this work on a mobile phone. It will just happen the way it should, which is really nice, because I imagine, you know, if you had to kind of struggle with that, you know, learning Bootstrap could take some time. So yeah, that gives you a little bit of an overview of the grid. As you can tell, I can use this layout drawer to drag out new elements, and basically each one will contain any number of cards stacked left to right. So next up, for kind of the design focus and where you may spend a lot of your time, is the text card. If you heard from earlier, you know, having easy scannable headings and doing things like taking an inventory of your terminology use on your site and making sure the page has a clear header hierarchy is really good. We also heard tips around consistency and chunking the site for different audiences. So to show you a little bit of that in action, I mean, editing text is relatively straightforward, but there's a lot of design nuance in when to apply which style and having a system of when you use what. So, you know, heading 1 is probably something you should only use near the top of your site to serve as a title. And then choosing heading levels, you have to kind of make a bulleted list of your content and decide, you know, how many different sections you're going to need. You can use subheading levels to mark those sections, and then within them, even further subheading levels to mark subsections and so forth. So coming up with, you know, how many levels you're going to have ahead of time for your text content and how you're going to chunk it up on the site is really important to have upfront before you start doing things, so you don't end up just using different heading levels in different places and you don't have a consistent look and feel to your site. A really good page that's out there that I recently made is this how-to resources. So you can tell this is a how-to guide for using a template in online, but I can fly through, and they chose to make the super heading levels using heading level 1 in these blue rows. So I can skim and find the next blue road section, and then I can, you know, look at that section if that's what I'm interested in. And then within that, they, you know, use a next heading level to do these major sections, and then within there, they have the kind of paragraph text and bullet lists and call outs and things like that. So this is just a good example. Like, it's pretty well laid out. The users could come in here and be like, I've already updated my local resources. I need to just do something with the look and feel and skip down to the section that is most appropriate to them, if it's something like a workflow or something like this. If you're in the market for writing some really custom HTML, the text card is how to do basically anything you want with custom HTML, text, images, otherwise. There's a lot of resources to learn the system, but Flexbox is a really great CSS set of classes that can help you align different menus and do things like that. There's a CSS tricks website that's really cool for finding, you know, little workarounds to implementing shapes and other things using pure CSS. This is good because then you don't have to upload or paste gigantic SVGs in. You can just, you know, through the magic of CSS, make shapes and do things that you didn't expect you could. In Bootstrap, we already talked about the grid system. Generally, you can Google Bootstrap and what you're looking for, like dropdown, and find documentation that explains how to do it. And the documentation is really good. Fonts come from Google. You can check out ARIA for screen readers. And don't forget, if you are going to write a lot of custom CSS, I recommend you should, you know, wrap that with your own custom class name so you don't collide with Enterprise Sites or Hub's CSS system. And just to show you how that all works, there is this whole code editor here. So if I had, for example, my own CSS or HTML I wanted to write, I can just write tags in here, and I'll be able to fully, you know, insert my own code in my site wherever I want. Moving on, so the other important part, if we have our text and our kind of our header and our theme, is the images. I mean, we heard the designers talk a lot about how to use images and when to use what. It's recommended you use row background images for those edge-to-edge, top of the site, catch your attention sort of imagery. So at the top, I think like a really good sites have an image at the top that explain the purpose. And then we heard some updates, you know, some advice around watching the contrast, you know, with there, and you can actually bleed into the background. And use images, the image card for the in layout images. So like once you have your background, if you want to do text and an image next to it, use the cards for that. And then consider that your image size could be a problem. So editing things down is important. Just to show that, like you can tell here, there's an amazing contrast between this white and that dark green image in the back. What they've actually done to make this image is they've set the background color to the theme color. And then we have the image here almost 93% transparent. So this is that idea of like, this is hard to read, right? It's like not that easy because the sky and the trees are not, they're too close in shade. So if you bleed it down, you still get this really nice feel, you still get the image, but you get this higher contrast. So that's like a good example of an image that we want that's like kind of grabbing our attention and explaining the purpose all at once. If I come down here, maybe later on, further down the page, I want to, you know, show something else. Maybe I want to show a gallery, and next to that gallery, I want to have, you know, an image representing what's in the gallery. I can dock an image to the right here and pick an image to be in line. So maybe I want to browse for something. This is always fun. Picture of, oh, it's too big. So that's actually, we do enforce the 3 megabyte size limit. And this is why my next point will be even better. So maybe I want to put this image next to a single app or something like that. These images will, by default, show the full image. But if we turn on scale image to fill, it will try to fill the container, which in this case, because I've got 4 cards, is pretty bad. So we might not want to do that. But in some cases, if you want the image to reflow and adapt to different container sizes as the screen changes shape, that can be really useful. And you can set where in the image to focus. So it's just kind of up to you how to play with these controls to figure out the right layout. And again, test in both mobile and in desktop. Editing your photos, Clara mentioned a really good tip. Take a look at the largest screen size that you need. You know, put all your content on a desktop, measure it just by taking a screenshot, and then make your photo that size. And this is a free open source photo editor if you have no other photo editing options to get your images to be the right size. I think we took a look at some of those image choices already, so we're going to move beyond that. Okay, last up, we want to look at how to show the content that's on your site. And there's really 3 high-level choices. You can embed using the iframe card or now the app card, which is new in 10.8. And that's a really good choice if you want to show 1 to 2 items. I would not recommend building a site that embeds like 10 things. That can be really problematic, especially on mobile phones with not a lot of memory, because it's loading like 10 browser tabs worth of information all at once. So really try to be judicious with your embedding. Just don't over embed. The gallery is good if you have like a handful of items. I recommend usually around 4. You know, more if you must. But this is a good way of like beyond the one thing you want them to see, here's a gallery of 4 really featured things. And then the category card and the search gives us that thousands of items, that search experience. So pull that up prominently if you're looking for really getting users to lots of content. And just how that looks on our sites to show each of those, you know, the gallery is good for featuring items. You can use dynamic or manual mode and pick some of your content that's maybe on your site. So pick a few things. And then the category is useful. Let's delete this row. Category is useful if I had thousands of items, because this will let me drop into the search results page with a pre-filter of tags or groups or things like that. And then last but not least, we have the embeds. And the embeds are best done, again, you can use the new app card. So this lets me, I can do apps, or I can pick something in my, in my organization that I want to embed. So maybe that's not a great user experience for a dashboard. I can also embed a map. Let's put it over here. Let's get rid of the block. All right. So this is what I mean. You can kind of play with what the default experience is. Let's get the maps in. But you wouldn't want to exceed 1 to 2 things. Like you can already tell this is like kind of feeling like a yard sale. So maybe I just want to feature this dashboard. And then your other option, if you have something just external, is the iframe is a sort of kind of escape hatch for embedding anything that allows embeds. So this is a good way to do that as well. So those are your kind of 3 flavors of embeds that you can design with for your site. To wrap up, let's give a few resources. I've already given a couple of links, but more generally, if you're looking to find some inspiration on your own, go to hub.arcgis.com, as we looked at earlier, and do that search. If you're interested in learning the application, even though Enterprise Sites doesn't yet have its own Learn lesson, we're working on that. Hub Basic and Hub Premium does. So check out the Hub Basic Learn lessons, because a lot of the same concepts are in those workflows. So check out learn.arcgis.com for that. In the app for Enterprise, you have these links down here at the bottom that get you to your portal's help. In online, we have a few other links. You can always find us on GeoNet as well. So feel free to go to any of these links. Special call out if you want to give us feedback about the development of the application, join our user lab. And Clara, who spoke earlier, and Katie wrote a great blog about designing your sites for accessibility, which is a great resource if you're interested in learning more about making your sites custom HTML and things like that, work with screen readers, and which features to shy away from and lean into. So thank you so much. We look forward from hearing you, and thanks for watching.